In the 3rd century AD, a significant political change had occurred in the Roman Empire's eastern neighbor. The Parthian Empire has been taken over by a new Persian power called the Sassanids. This new empire had become a much bigger threat than the Parthians ever were, for the Sassanids were able to penetrate deep into Roman territory and sack the city of Antioch, an accomplishment the Parthians never achieved. This new development brings a question. How did the Sassanids overthrow the Parthians? And what changes had occurred in the east that allowed the Sassanids to become more powerful than the Parthians ever were? To answer this question, one has to look at the sources. It is difficult to get a full picture of how the Sassanids defeated the Parthians, for most of the surviving contemporary sources for this period comes from the Romans. Like the works of Cassius Dio and Herodotus, had given much information about Rome's interaction with the dying Parthian Empire and the newly made Sassanid Empire, but little about the events within the empire. As for the eastern perspective, most surviving sources about the rise of the Sassanids were written centuries after the events. It doesn't seem like the Parthians left many written accounts that survive today, so we don't have their perspective on the collapse of the empire. As for the Sassanids, we have the Book of Deeds of Ardashir, son of Papak, and legendary account of the empire's founder, Ardashir. The Sassanids had also written a general history of the empire called a Quade Namag, a book commissioned by the Sassanid Emperor Khusro in the 7th century, but most of its contents have been lost in time. Instead, many modern historians relied on the works written hundreds of years later, like the Book of Kings by the Arab writer Al-Tabari, written in the 9th century, and the Shahnameh by the Persian writer Ferdowsi, written in the 10th, both of which must have based their narratives from the long-lost Quade Namag. We also have many Armenian and late Roman sources who also wrote about this period. However, the sources contradict each other, and most of their contents are based on legendary rather than actual accounts, so their accuracy is a bit dubious. For example, they don't agree with each other on who Papak is and his relationship with Ardashir and Sassan. In the Shahnameh, which is similar to the Book of Deeds, Papak was a governor of a province called Fars, who hired a man named Sassan to become one of his laborers. Then one night, Papak had a dream about Sassan becoming a king. When Papak asked Sassan what the dream was about, Sassan revealed that he was a descendant of the ancient Achaemenid kings. Papak, believing this, had his daughter marry Sassan to create a child named Ardashir. In Al-Tabari's version, Sassan was a custodian of a fire temple and is the father of Papak, while Papak is the father of Ardashir. A late Roman historian named Agathias also has a different version, of which he claimed to get his sources from the Sassanid library. According to him, Papak was a leather worker and Sassan was a traveling soldier who became a guest in Papak's home. Using some manner of astrology, Papak believes that Sassan's offspring was destined for greatness. Papak wanted to raise this child, but he did not have any female relations, so he yielded his wife to Sassan in order to create Ardashir. As it became apparent, the sources do not seem to agree whether or not Papak is Ardashir's father, stepfather, or adopted father of Ardashir. Fortunately, a discovery made by archaeologists had shed light on this issue. When the Ottoman Empire disintegrated in the early 20th century, many archaeologists had flocked to the Middle East to find the ruins of many ancient civilizations. Above the city of Persepolis, they found many rock reliefs with inscriptions written for the Sassanid emperors. In the inscription for Shapur, we found that Papak is the father of Ardashir, and Ardashir was the father of Shapur. This is the version Shapur preferred to be remembered as, and is the one that's most likely to be the case. There are even different titles given to each person. Papak was the lord of Whittaker, Ardashir, lord of all Iran, and Shapur, lord of Iran and non-Iran, which shows a progression of power in each generation. Each story also had a different version of how Ardashir rose to power. In the Book of Deeds and the Shahnameh, the Parthian king Artabundas employed Ardashir to become his servant. When Artabundas received the prophecy that a king would be overthrown by a new ruler, his maiden ran to tell Ardashir this story, and then they both escaped from Artabundas' palace. Artabundas pursued them but was unable to catch up with them. When Ardashir arrived at Fars, he found a people that were dissatisfied with Artabundas' rule, so they created an army and marched back to Artabantus. Ardashir then fought multiple battles with Artabantus before killing him, thus taking over his kingdom. This story also had mythical enemies like the Cult of the Worm, a cult that's created around the worship of a giant worm. In this version, Ardashir's army was besieging the worm's castle, but he was betrayed by one of his subjects named Merak, which resulted in his defeat by the worm's armies. Ardashir then created another army, killed Merak, and then he snuck into the worm's domain and killed it before destroying the worm's army. In Al-Tabari's version, Ardashir's father Papak had sent Ardashir to the south Istakhr named Gochir, so he could be raised by a eunuch named Tira to become governor of a place called Darab. When Tira died, Ardashir took over his office. Ardashir then receives a dream that he is destined to become a powerful king, so he started killing other rulers around him to take over their territory. Ardashir then sent letters to Papak telling him everything he had accomplished and told him to kill Gochir and take over Istakhr, which Papak did. However, this action has gotten the ire of Emperor Artabantus, who declared Ardashir and Papak rebels. When Papak died, Papak's other son, Shapur, who suddenly appeared in the story, declared war on Ardashir, but died in an accident, when part of a building broke off and fell on top of him. Ardashir continued to expand his territory by crushing internal rebellions and killing other lords, including one named Merak, the same Merak who betrayed Ardashir in the Book of Deeds, although in Al-Tabari's version he was just another lord. Artabantus sends armies to kill Ardashir, but Ardashir defeats them. Artabantus then scheduled a battle with Ardashir at a place called Hormizd again, of which Ardashir agreed. During the battle, Ardashir rushed towards Artabantus and killed him, while his troops slaughtered the rest of Artabantus' army, allowing Ardashir to conquer the rest of the empire. Each story also seemed to follow the same fanciful account of how his successors were born, with slight variations. In all three versions, Ardashir had murdered most of the family members of both Artabantus and Merak except the daughters. Ardashir would also try to execute Artabantus' daughter, only for her to be saved by his servant that hid her away from Ardashir because she was pregnant with Ardashir's child. However, each source had told the story differently. In the Book of Deeds and the Shahnameh, Artabantus' daughter tried to poison Ardashir, but failed, which resulted in him ordering her execution. In Al-Tabari's version, Artabantus' daughter only survived the massacre of her family because she told Ardashir that she was just a handmaiden, and Ardashir only ordered her execution after she revealed her true identity. After the servant had hid Artabantus' daughter in both Al-Tabari's version and the Shahnameh, the servant cuts off his own testicles, locks them in a box, and gives it to Ardashir, but in the Book of Deeds his balls remain unharmed. When the child was born, he was named Shapur, the same name as Ardashir's brother. There seems to be no significance of this. After several years had passed, Ardashir started to get upset that he has no sons and regrets the killing of Artabantus' daughter, until his servant tells him that Artabantus' daughter is still alive, and she bore him a son. If the version involves the servant cutting off his own testicles, he had Ardashir open up the box as proof that the child really is Ardashir's son, and that he only disobeyed his orders with the best intentions. With Merak's daughter, all three versions said she escaped the massacre of her family to become adopted by a farmer. But after some years had passed, she coincidentally met Shapur, who fell in love with her. They then have a child together named Hormizd, unbeknownst to Ardashir, of which he eventually finds out and accepts the child anyways. It seems like the stories were made to look like Ardashir did not intend to have his successors be offspring of him and his former enemies, which is unlikely, for it's more reasonable to assume that Ardashir wanted a pure royal bloodline for each successor. Neither of the daughters were named in each of the three versions. They're only referred to as a daughter or mother to someone else. Only in the inscriptions to Shapur has the name Murad appear for Shapur's mother, who is claimed to be of royal blood. We don't know if this Murad actually is Artabantus' daughter, but it's possible. The contemporary Roman sources have a completely different story about Ardashir. Herodian and Cassius did not go into a lot of detail about the rise of Ardashir, only that he fought numerous battles against the Parthians and killed Artabantus to establish his own empire. But they did provide a little information about the events that took place within the Parthian Empire that could explain how Ardashir was able to take control. They mentioned that after the Parthian emperor Vologases had died, his sons Vologases and Artabantus started a war with each other. Amidst this war, the emperor Caracalla had launched a surprise raid into Parthian territory, causing much devastation to the provinces, and on his return to Roman territory, he was betrayed and killed by his guard named Macrinus. Artabantus, being incensed by the devastating raid, assembled a large army and wrought his vengeance towards Macrinus. Macrinus assembled the Romans to defend the provinces, and the battles between them resulted in a stalemate with massive casualties on both sides. Macrinus assured Artabantus that the man responsible for the violation of his provinces had been killed, and then paid a large sum of coins towards Artabantus as compensation before they both made peace. These events occurred around the year 217, a couple of years before the empire had been toppled in 224, which explains why the Parthians in their weakened state would have been unable to suppress the Persians, whose power only grew at the expense of the Parthians. After Ardashir had defeated and killed Artabantus, he then demanded that all the territories in Egypt and Asia that the ancient Achaemenid Empire once held belong to him. Since they are in possession of the Romans, this was a declaration of war. The reigning Roman emperor of the day, Alexander Severus, replied that it would be unwise to make such demands, considering how other emperors had crushed the Parthians in the past. Undeterred, Ardashir, or Artaxerxes, which the sources sometimes call him, raided Roman Mesopotamia. Alexander had prepared an army, but he still gave peace proposals to Ardashir, which were rejected. Instead, Ardashir sent an embassy with 400 of his tallest Persians with the finest weapons and clothes towards Alexander to impress the emperor, and demanded that Alexander should hand over all the territories east of the Aegean Sea. Alexander then stripped the Persian envoys of their finery and put them to work in the farms. When the preparation for war was done, the Romans launched an attack against the Sassanid Empire. The course of events is uncertain. Most Roman sources reported that the campaign was successful, while Herodian alone said it was a disaster. In all likelihood, it could have been both. According to Herodian, the Romans launched a three-pronged attack against the Sassanid Empire. The northern attack had beaten back the Sassanids and ravaged the northern provinces. The southern attack went deep into the empire east of the Euphrates. This was supposed to be supported by the main army commanded by Severus Alexander himself, but this army was delayed. Herodian presumed Alexander's mother had tried to delay the invasion to protect her son, and as a result the Sassanids sent their full force against the southern army and destroyed it. It's unlikely that a mother's fears could delay an entire army. It's more likely because of the disciplinary problems within the military. Many sources did mention that multiple mutinies had occurred before the invasion. According to the Historia Augusta, when Alexander reached Antioch, his soldiers started neglecting their duties to spend an exorbitant amount of time drinking, bathing, and fornicating with the local women. When the emperor tried to force them to stop, they threatened to mutiny, and it took over a month until he got everything resolved before he could launch his invasion. The most likely scenario of the campaign is that the northern flank was successful. The main force had been delayed by either disciplinary or supply issues, while the southern flank ended disastrously. After the campaign, Severus Alexander did present to the Senate a large amount of prisoners and spoils of war he captured from the Sassanids, which indicates that he did assume victory. After all, Herodian did say the Romans had inflicted heavy casualties on the Sassanid army, and that the Romans only lost because they were heavily outnumbered. This entire episode is not mentioned by the Persian sources at all, probably because the entire event was too embarrassing to mention. The next emperor, Shapur, proved to be even more troublesome for the Romans. According to the Sassanid inscriptions, the Persians had defeated the Romans in the pitched battle and killed the Roman Emperor Gordian, but the Roman sources describe Gordian's death differently. The Romans said that Gordian was too young and inexperienced to command armies, so his Praetorian prefect Timicius handled the campaigns on his behalf. Timicius was initially successful at defeating the Sassanids, but had died, either due to natural causes or by a plot by his replacement Philip the Arab. It's been said that Philip had sabotaged the campaign by diverting food supplies from the army and then pitted the blame against Gordian. The angry soldiers then killed Gordian, making Philip the emperor of Rome. Philip then paid a large sum of money to the Sassanids before making peace. It's difficult to tell what actually happened. The Persians were not inclined to chisel in stories of their defeats, and the Romans may have tried to cover up stories of their own defeat. But whatever the case may be, there doesn't seem to be any territorial change as a result. A couple of years later, Shapur had launched another campaign against the Romans. The Sassanid inscriptions vaguely claimed that it was because the Roman Caesar lied and did wrong in Armenia. However, the Armenian sources said that a Parthian assassin had killed Armenian king Khusro and then invaded Armenia, which forced his son Tiridates III to flee to the Roman Empire. The Roman refusal to give up Tiridates must have been the casus belli for war, of which the Sassanids had claimed to have destroyed a Roman army and ravaged Roman Syria. The Emperor Valerian, who was preoccupied with the other fronts, took years to assemble his own army, but this army was weakened by a plague before it was defeated and captured by the Sassanids. Tens of thousands of captured Roman soldiers and civilians were marched into Sassanid territory, and many Eastern sources wrote about how these Roman prisoners of war were utilized to build dams and bridges for the Sassanid Empire. The Dam of Zoraster is one example, a Persian acknowledgement of good Roman engineering. After the Sassanids had defeated Valerian, they proceeded to raid the provinces of Cappadocia and Sicilia. The Romans had reported that when Shapur returned to his own territory, one of his armies was ambushed and defeated by a Palmyrian king named Odenathus, but the Persian sources made no mention of this. Shapur would later die naturally of an illness and had been replaced by his son Hormizd. The next couple of emperors only received small mentions in the works of Al-Tabari and the Shahnameh, and by the time of Diocletian's reign, the reigning Sassanid emperor of the time was Bahram II, but his throne was contested by his brother or cousin, the sources don't seem to agree, who also carried the name Hormizd. This Hormizd had allied himself with several eastern tribes like the Saka, Rufi, and Gali against Bahram II, and it took until near the end of Bahram II's reign to finally end Hormizd's rebellion. Shapur's success against the Romans brings up a question. How was the Sassanid military able to achieve more than the Parthians? Their military had the same basic concept. The elites of the society would be part of the heavy cavalry, backed by larger numbers of lighter cavalry, mostly composed of lesser nobles and retainers, which in turn are supported by the levy infantrymen, which make up a large part of the forces. Roman historian Herodian mentioned that the Parthians didn't use mercenaries, which is unlikely, but sources did mention mercenaries more often in the Sassanid Empire than in the Parthian. The use of elephants from India also showed up more often as well, usually carrying a driver and a few riders in the back. However, the biggest advantage the Sassanids have over the Parthians is siege technology. The Parthians didn't seem to have obtained a reputation for being siege experts, for we don't have many accounts of Parthians conducting successful sieges against the Romans. But for the Sassanids, the inscription to Shapur has a list of cities that were burned and plundered by his armies. One of the cities on the list was Dura, of which its ruins had been found in Syria by archaeologists. By the looks of it, the siege of Dura appeared to be successfully concluded by a mining operation, a strategy where sappers dug tunnels underneath the walls. By the 4th century, we have accounts by Roman historians that the Sassanids had utilized catapults, siege towers, ballistas, and old-fashioned ladders. Another difference between the Parthian and Sassanid Empire is the centralization of the government. The Parthian Empire was composed of several semi-independent principalities, each with their own king, or Shahs as they were called, and they were altogether ruled by the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. The Mazdaean religion that the Persians had worshipped since ancient times was upheld by a loose company of priests all over the empire, while the Parthian elite worshipped a wide variety of different cults. The Sassanids, on the other hand, had a more extensive court and bureaucracy, exemplified by the long list of bureaucrats written in Shapurs' inscriptions, which allowed the Shahanshah to take greater control over the provinces. This centralization also extends to the Mazdaean religion of Zoroastrian, with the creation of a state church with its own organized hierarchy of priests called mobeds. Much like how the Shahanshah was the head of the Shahs, the Mobadan Mobed was the head of the Mobeds. The creation of the Zoroastrian church had taken generations to form, but it was reportedly initiated by Ardashir's attempt to create Zoroastrian orthodoxy. It's been said that the emperor had collected many Mazdaean books from all over the empire to have his priest Tanja review them and to establish a canonical story. However, most of the groundwork had been made by a priest named Cartier, who played a central role in the development of the church during the reign of Bahram and Bahram II. In his attempts to establish a Zoroastrian orthodoxy, he persecuted beliefs that he considered heretical, like Manichaeism, a dualistic religion created by a man named Mani in the early 3rd century. It's also been said that he extended the persecutions to the Jews and Christians, but this seems to be only temporary. The Christians and Jews lived under the millet system, whereby the leaders of the religious communities were responsible for the collection of taxes, as well as the maintenance of law and order within their communities. Although there have been persecutions, they are usually temporary. The Sassanids' greater control over their provinces allowed them to better utilize their resources. Not only did the Sassanids improve their military technology, they've also created more infrastructure and building projects than their Parthian predecessors. The rich and fertile lands of Mesopotamia was a conduit between the edges of the known world, which allowed them to make substantial income from the trade caravans that passed through them. But this position was also vulnerable to attacks by the dangerous and intractable people of the steppes. Even though the Sassanids had overtaken the Parthian Empire, they continued to work with the Parthian elite, most notably the families of the House of Shuran and the House of Cary, whose skills in battle continued to be useful in Sassanid armies. With the possession of one of the wealthiest provinces in the Middle East and the powerful armies of Iran, the Sassanids were able to assemble armies large enough to match the Romans on the field.